I would strongly recommend that you have these prophecies somewhere written in your Bible, the beginning or the end, front to the back, because these prophecies are written for you. All the evil of Noah's day, all the evil of Lot's day will converge into a single generation. Believers will lose their patience, not all, because in the parable there is a faithful servant who waits, and the Lord commends him. But there's also that unfaithful servant. Mark 13, watch lest he find you sleeping. Luke 21, the warning of overindulgence, drunkenness, and the cares of this life. Perversion in 2 Timothy 3, self-focused, disobedient to parents. Scoffers in 2 Peter 3 who would rather walk after their own lusts. See, that's really probably what happened to the 15 people in that picture that are no longer in the truth. They're now walking after their own lusts, whatever they're doing, and they have given up on the truth. And lastly, in Revelation 16, where we ended yesterday, the danger of losing our garments of right living. So we covered this Monday, and you see how the warning of the Lord Jesus Christ and the warning of Paul and the warning of Peter and the warning of John, it's all the same warning. It's all painting the same picture. And God said this is going to be so dangerous for you that I'm not going to record it once. I'm not going to record it twice. I'm going to record it at least 10 times in the Bible. In the last days, times will be perilous. Times will be evil. Times will be wicked. Be warned, be careful that you don't lose your garments, because God is trying to save us. And you notice, God didn't say in the Bible that before all this wickedness happens, I'm going to take the believers and their children out of the picture so they are spared. God says, I'm going to leave the believers right in the world. And Jesus isn't going to return until after these conditions develop. So the faithful are going to have to learn to endure these conditions, which means Katie number 1 and Katie number 2 have a decision to make. And Abby has a decision to make, and Savannah has a decision to make, and Byron has a decision to make, and Lincoln has a decision to make, and Joseph has a decision, as does Benjamin. We all have a decision to make. How are we going to allow these conditions to impact our life? Because if the Jacob on my left or the Jacob on my right do not take a firm stand for the truth in their life, these conditions will overwhelm them. Same thing with Alana, same thing with Carolyn, same thing with Uncle Ken. We each have to learn of the danger of these conditions and be convicted in our heart that we will not allow these evil conditions to overcome us. That's what God is looking for. And it doesn't happen at baptism. If Benjamin does not make a commitment to holiness years before his baptism, then by the time he's of baptism age, it may be too late. So don't think that you can wait till you're baptized before you make a commitment to stay away from the evil. Because if you wait until then, you may never get baptized. And that's what happened to some of those 20 people in that photograph. So God is looking for you to make a commitment now to holiness. Give me 4 examples of people in the Bible who set their heart to seek God when they were very young. Number 1, now you are Natalie? Natalie. David set his heart. David. Samuel set his heart. 2 more. Katie. Who? Ruth. We don't know how young she was, but certainly by the time she was married to her husband, she had either learned the truth or she had embraced it shortly thereafter. So another good example, one more. Young person who set their heart to serve God and said, it doesn't matter what conditions I find myself, I am staying faithful to God regardless of what comes. Go ahead, Joseph. Benjamin, sorry. Who? Jesus. Excellent example. I should have excluded him. No, he's a good example. You have Daniel, you have Josiah, lots of different examples. So you're not too young to make a commitment to live a holy life. Jacob and Lindsay and Lincoln and Savannah and all the rest of us. If you don't, you're going to find yourself in trouble. So quickly, this is what we saw. There will be an explosion of evil. God is removed from the society. There's no fear of God. So you probably hear, if you go to a public school, people readily taking God's name in vain because they have no fear of God. And they use language that is totally inappropriate, but they have no fear of God. They talk about things they ought not to be talking about. They are involved in relationships. And in those relationships, they take those relationships to an area that they should never take prior to marriage because they have no fear of God. There's going to be an excessive focus on self. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money and pleasure. Society will be obsessed with sin. It will fill their minds and govern their conduct. Perilous times for believers. Difficult times to survive. Some believers will grow impatient, and as a result, they will stop waiting for Jesus' return. Belief in the creation and flood will cease. New forms of evil will continually be imagined. And I should say here, I hate to mention these things because I don't want you to go chasing them. But there is a cable company in the United States called HBO. Has anybody heard of it? They know about all these things. They have no fear of God. Back in the year 1999, they had a very popular program on TV called The Sopranos. And the reason it was popular was because it had more violence and immorality than any other program had ever had. Extremely popular. But as time goes on, a TV program can only last so many years, and they had to finally have the last episode. And they replaced it with a new series that became the most popular series on TV. And the name of that series? Game of Thrones. Most popular series, I think, in the US, maybe Canada, across in Europe, I don't know. Hugely popular. You know why it was so popular? Because it had more sex and more violence and more immorality than any television program ever had. And this 2-3 months ago, I didn't see the program, I only saw the article, that they had their final episode, and everybody had to come and watch this episode. But now it's gone. So guess what HBO has done? They're coming out with a new series. I'm not going to tell you the name because I don't want you to go search it out. But this new series is going to have more sex, more violence, and more immorality among teenagers than any program ever has. So as time goes on, they have to invent and create new forms of evil that are more degrading and more immoral because they're looking to attract more and more and more people. If they were to run reruns of their series called The Sopranos back in the 1990s, people wouldn't watch. If they were to run reruns of the Game of Thrones, people wouldn't watch. People want something new, something more evil, more sinful, more immoral. And the movie makers and the TV producers are following. So be careful, young people, what you are willing to expose yourself to. If we don't take a stand for holiness in our life, we end up we end up being overcome by it. We've talked about homosexuality, marriage to unbelievers, women's physical beauty becoming a snare to young men in the truth, young people learning about evil at a very young age, people not being afraid to speak against God and blaspheme his name, society teaching children to disobey their parents. Violence and immorality will become commonplace. And so we have what I call the slippery slope. Now, if you're not comfortable with math and graphs, don't get nervous. It doesn't get too complicated. We're not going to do any trig formulas, as Uncle Peter talked about yesterday. But this graph is depicting, if you can see, on the y-axis is godliness. On the x-axis is time. So as time goes on, and this red line depicts the level of godliness in society. What happens as time unfolds in society? Does the godliness of society go up, or does the godliness in society go down? And this is the Bible warning. So that in 1999, society was here in terms of the standards for television programs, for music, for radio programs, for movies, for video games. And there were certain laws in place in the United States and Canada. Fellas, I don't know about the United Kingdom. I suspect they had the same kinds of laws that said on television you can only show so much. But you see, then as time goes on, by the time we come to 2019, those standards have declined. And as a result, what also declines is the godliness in society. I'll show you in a couple minutes some proof of how this has happened. So this is what's happening in society at large. And again, you can apply this to the music industry, you can apply it to the movie industry, to the television industry, anything to do with entertainment. This is what is happening over time. And the danger for us is that God is asking us to live in this society. So the fact that you can turn on a radio or you can go to websites today, I'm not sure how many even have radios anymore. You can, click into the latest songs that are most popular, and you can hear the artists singing about violence, singing about fornication, singing about sexual immorality in ways they couldn't do 20 years ago. See, society wouldn't have let them. You look at the most popular songs today, the most popular television programs, the most popular movies, far, far, far greater amounts of sex and immorality and violence than 20 years ago. You see, that's Bible prophecy being fulfilled. Advertisers who are appealing to you, whether it's clothing, whatever it is, and there's far more sensuality, there's far greater emphasis on young ladies to expose greater portions of their body. That is Bible prophecy being fulfilled. You can turn on a television or go to the movies and see fornication among young people being glorified. That is Bible prophecy being fulfilled. You can click on pornographic pictures in your own home, on your own phone. That is Bible prophecy being fulfilled. And each of us needs to learn how to take a stand against these influences, because God is not going to spare us. So, you can use a graph to identify the decline in movies, music videos, dress, video games, television. You can also use this graph to depict the declining evil conditions that existed in Noah's day. Now, in his case, you'd have to stretch it out further than the 30 years or 40 years we have depicted. But over the life of Noah, he saw society generally degrade. And as a result, as every year passed, things got worse. So, here is a picture of one of the most popular television programs from the 1960s. It was called The Dick Van Dyke Show. And when they had a bedroom scene, this is the bedroom scene depicted in the 1960s. The standards of that day would not permit the husband and the wife on the television program to be in the same bed. Now, husband and wives in the 1960s didn't sleep in separate beds, but that's as much as the TV standards would permit. Contrast that with today. And what if a person wanted could view on television in terms of what happens in bedrooms. depicted on the screen. Here's a study from Harvard, the Harvard School of Public Health. One of the professors went and took 1,900 films, and he had his students make a check mark for the films that were produced in 1992. Every time they heard swearing, every time sexual immorality was depicted, every time there was violence, they checked it off. And then he gave them films from 2003, and they did the same thing. And they found out that between 1992 and 2003, a movie in 1992 that was given a PG-13 rating, and then a movie in 2003 that was given a PG-13 rating, same rating. In the 2003 film, there was far more sex, far more violence, far more immorality than what had happened in 1992. So he went to Hollywood and said, how come you have movies in 2003 that still have a PG-13 rating, but they are much like the R-rated movies back in 1992? And the answer was, well, as society declines, our movies just keep up with the standards of society. So this person is not a Christadelphian. And he was proving empirically that you cannot trust G, PG-13, PG, R, because all that tells you is who can go into the movie house today, who can go into the cinema today, but has no clue, has no validity on what the actual content of the movie is. Studies in 2004, 2010, and 2014 validate this phenomena of ratings creep. That movies today with a more kid-friendly rating of G and PG contain greater amounts of violence and sex than movies with a similar rating 20 years ago. The Pediatrics magazine in 2014 said parents become desensitized over time when viewing material featuring adult content. Viewers watching a series of bloodthirsty or erotic scenes were less able to gauge their suitability for children as time went by. So be warned and beware. Here is a study of video games. They now have the ability to have people play video games, and they can hook up an MRI machine, which is multi-resonance, not sure what the full name is. But they can watch your brain as a person is playing video games. And what they found, this study was from 2006, that those who are playing violent video games where people are being shot up and killed and their bodies are blown up on the screen, they have a different part of their brain that is exercised than people who are playing non-video games. And they have concluded, based on the facts, that when you're involved in that kind of activity, your brain is impacted differently, such that, now I'm not a brain surgeon or I'm not a brain specialist or an expert, but these brain scans they took reveal the impact of playing violent video games upon our brain. Now, I don't know who in here plays violent video games. We talked the other day about how it's more attractive to young fellas typically than to young ladies. But if you are playing violent video games where the goal is to search out the enemy and blow him or her to smithereens, or to find some young lady and then abuse her, or whatever they're doing, that's impacting your brain. And again, if you're under 18, you probably only have access to a certain type of video game. And if you get comfortable playing video games at 15, 16, and 17, there is an entirely different market for people who are 27, 28, and 29 playing video games, because there are no standards once people become adults. So we need to beware and be warned. 2014 update, remember this study was from Cambridge. I believe. No, the next one coming up is from Cambridge. So Iowa State University in 2014 said children who repeatedly play violent video games are learning thought patterns that will stick with them and influence behaviors as they grow older. If you practice over and over and over again, you have that knowledge in your head. The fact that you haven't played the piano in years doesn't mean you can't still sit down and play something. This would be typical for adults. Gentiles said, now that's the person they interviewed, it's the same with violent games. You practice being vigilant for enemies, practice thinking that it's acceptable to respond aggressively to provocation, and practice becoming desensitized to the consequences of violence. Very dangerous. Remember what God said in the days of Noah, what were the two predominant conditions that existed in Genesis 6? Violence and immorality. And the video game industry is making money off of this. 2018, another study confirmed the link between violent video games and physical aggression. The study found violent video games do cause players to become more physically aggressive. An international study looking at more than 17,000 kids, ages 9 to 19, from 2010 to 2017, found playing violent video games led to increased violent aggression over time. Those who played violent games such as Grand Auto Theft, Call to Duty, and Manhunt were more likely to exhibit violent behavior and their own character. So if you're playing these games, fellas or ladies, they are impacting your brain, they are impacting your character. And you are placing yourself under the influence of society. Cambridge University. Now, I talked to your dad the other day about Cambridge. Did he live in Cambridge? Did he attend Cambridge? So Cambridge is a highly respected university in England. I don't know where it ranks, but it's up there probably with Harvard and with Yale and some of the finer universities that the United States has in England. I'm not saying they're just as good, but I'm just for comparison purposes. So the Cambridge people did a study on the addiction of viewing pornography. And they concluded that it affects a brain in the same way as alcoholism or drug abuse. And again, they used an MRI study. And they looked at, these are healthy volunteers and what their brain looks like. These are those who are given to compulsive viewing of pornography. And they can see where the human brain is impacted differently by people who are addicted to this type of viewing. It has an impact on their brain. So what science is telling us is it's vindicating God's warning in the Bible regarding sin. When we sin, this has a negative impact on how we think and how we act and how we make decisions. They now know it has a chemical impact on our brain, causing us to want to commit even more sin, because that's what happens. The brain develops this addiction and the body develops this addiction, and it wants more and more sin, just like alcoholism, just like smoking. Pornography has the same type of impact. Or drugs. God didn't create us automatically to reject sin. We have to make an individual decision to do that. If we choose sin, our brains will temporarily thrive on it, crave more, but eventually begin to deteriorate. Viewing pornography can be just as addictive and destructive as these other factors. And so both science and God warn us of the dangers of sin. Now we're going to talk about the dangers of a smartphone. Who would think a smartphone would be dangerous? Now, we're not up here to tell you to get rid of your smartphone. We just bought our first one a month ago. So they have to be used in a way that will not encourage wrong behavior, wrong thinking, wrong conduct on our part. But smartphones are competing with God. Because you see, for God to save us, God has to transform us. He has to take Hannah and make her into a new person. He has to take Uncle Ken and make him into a new person. He has to take Benjamin and make him into a new person. He has to take Lindsay and make her into a new person. A new person who thinks differently, who loves differently, who forgives differently, who treats other people differently, who talks differently. They don't just listen to their natural mind and do whatever the natural mind wants. But for God to save Jacob, he has to transform Jacob into a new person. And to transform us into a new person, he has to get his word into our minds. He cannot do it any other way. I can't show you a movie. I can't show you another book. I can't take you to a website. You can't look at a YouTube video. There's nothing else God can do to transform us other than to get the principles of this book into our hearts and minds. That's the only way the transformation process can happen. And it's a mammoth task on God's part to transfer Elena or KD1 or KD2 into new people. And that's the last time, ladies, I apologize. Last time I'll talk about KD1 and KD2. But you see, God has to change us. The only way he can change us is to get his word into our hearts. And if he can't do that, then he can't transform us. So Benjamin will be, or Jonathan will be, the very same person in 2024 as he is in 2019 if he doesn't allow God's word into his heart and mind. In the past 10 years, this effort by God to transform us has become much, much more difficult. Partly because what all these people have in common is they are now all developing an addiction to their smartphone. Whether they are texting, whether they are watching movies, they're watching television programs, listening to the internet, going on social media, whatever it is. Young people and old people are allowing an electronic device to take over their life. Again, I am not suggesting you get rid of your smartphone if you have one. Just be very, very careful how much time you allow that device to eat up in your life. Because these devices make the transformation process very difficult. God isn't going to try to compete with a smartphone. He is not going to develop an app or a website or a YouTube video. He'll never send you a text. He will never send you an email. He won't set up a Facebook page. He won't have a Twitter account. So you will never be able to communicate with God through your smartphone. He's given us one source and one source alone, and that is his word, because that is inspired. Those are his words that were written down by the authors of the Bible. If we want to get to know him, we must do so on his terms. If we're not willing to take the time to read the Bible, we can't expect to be in the kingdom. 15 of the 20 people in that picture stopped reading their Bible at some point. And 15 of the 20 people in the picture that Uncle Eric referred to will not be in the kingdom unless they make a change in their life. Unless we're willing to think and reflect and meditate upon his principles and how they should apply in our life, he can't change us. And if he can't change us, he can't save us. When we leave God's input out of our life, we make it impossible for him to save us. So we need to learn how to hold ourselves accountable to these devices. The danger, this is just some of them, there may be others. They can devour our time and rob God of the time we should spend with him. You know, people can spend a couple hours on social media and they feel real good afterwards because they've made contact with all their friends, but have not spent time with God. They make readily available a wide array of sin, and they encourage its pursuit. You know, you are always only ever one click away from sin when you're on the internet. One click away from sin. The kind of sin that can overwhelm us, the kind of sin that can lead us down a path that will take us away from the kingdom. Social media encourages the promotion of self. Remember what 2 Timothy 3 said? They won't be lovers of God, they will be lovers of three things. What were they? You got one, Jonathan? Money. David, another one? Themselves. And the third one, Jacob? Pleasures. So Timothy warned us, in the latter days, you watch, people are going to be lovers of themselves. And with this device, I can tell everybody, all my friends, everything about me. I can take pictures of what I'm doing, what I'm thinking of doing, all my friends, where I'm going, and encourage everybody to look at me. Look at me, look at me, look at me. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a Facebook page. I'm not saying that social media should be banned. We just need to make sure we're using it in a way that will be helpful. If Jesus was here today with his 12 disciples, would he use WhatsApp to stay in touch with them? I don't know. Effectively, you could. If you had 12 people that you were trying to do something in the truth with, and brethren and sisters use electronic devices to stay in touch with each other, family uses it to stay in touch with each other, so there are good uses. We just have to make sure that we are using these electronic devices for good use. So we've got a couple of guidelines before we text or before we post something on social media. Number one, is the focus on God or on myself? Would Jesus want me to communicate what I'm about to send? Will it be spiritually helpful or hurtful to others? Will this take people's minds to God or away from God? Will this help people get into the kingdom? And we need to think, is it true, helpful, imitating Christ? Is it necessary, and is it kind? And lastly, is it consistent with each of the commandments of Christ? And again, young people, you're going to have to hold yourself accountable to this, because your parents are not going to watch while you are texting. They may today, depending on your age, but you will get to the age soon where if you have a smartphone, you will be very independent of your parents, and you will be able to make your own decisions to use that device in any way you decide to use it. And you will be in a position to allow that device to influence your life in any way you decide. It's interesting that Apple uses the very symbol of a bitten fruit, which takes us back to Genesis 3 and the fall of Adam and Eve. Only in this case, it didn't result in the fall of man. This electronic device, if we're not careful, will actually place us outside the scope of God being able to save us. So quickly, between 30 years ago and today, homosexuality used to be illegal. When I was going to school, when Uncle Craig was going to school, it was illegal to be homosexual. Today it's promoted and defended. When I was in grade school, we used to open each day with a prayer. That is now illegal in the schools in Michigan. Evolution used to be considered illegal. Now it's promoted teaching. Fornication used to be considered immoral, and society promoted abstinence. Not anymore. Fornication is now expected, and the use of protection is what society encourages. So schools make available protection for young people. And just in the last couple of years, with all the sexting that takes place, if you're not familiar with that term, don't go search it out. But if you are familiar with that term, ladies, be very, 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 very careful with whom you begin a relationship with a young man. Because the expectation of the young men in the world is now that you should be willing to share yourself with them in pictures. That's where society is going. That is not where we want to go. Remember that slope that's going downhill quickly. Be selective, be careful, be prudent. Look for young men who have a fear of God. Cohabitation used to be considered immoral. It is now expected. Anybody know who this is? I believe his name is Dumbledore, or is there an F on the end? Dumbledore. The reason I like to show his picture is in 1997, when the first book came out in the series on Harry Potter, Professor Dumbledore was featured in that book. And then, as you know, several more books were written between 1997 and 2007. In 2007, the author of these books hosted a conference in Madison Square Gardens in New York. And 10,000 of her fans came to that meeting. And at that meeting, she announced that Mr. Dumbledore, Professor Dumbledore, actually is homosexual. And they gave her a standing ovation. She went on to admit that in 1997, she could not admit that he was homosexual because it would have cost her the sales of her books. So in 10 years, society had completely changed its perspective on this issue. And the Bible told us, you watch, time of the end, expect to see this degradation. And we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your participation. I think I went over a minute again, so I now owe you 2 minutes.